So last week we talked about kind of the context of Jeremiah, and so we're at the end of the seventh and the start of the 6th centuries BCE. And just a reminder of this, there's differences as far as when people believe Jeremiah's ministry began, whether it was around like 627 BCE was either the time of his birth or the start of his public ministry. And um, and so there's differences in belief of that. And when you think Jeremiah began his ministry, when his writings began, kind of changes how you read the book of Jeremiah. But we will jump right in. We read chapters 1 through 24 for tonight, so we'll look through those. But let's start with a video from the Bible Project. We've used these ones before, and this is kind of giving us an overview on Jeremiah and give us an idea of what's all happening and a reminder of what all you read.
The book of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah was an Israelite priest who lived and worked in Jerusalem during the final decades of the kingdom of southern Judah. He was called as a prophet to warn Israel about the severe consequences of breaking their covenant with God through their idolatry and injustice, and he even predicted that the empire of Babylon would come as God's servant to bring this judgment on Israel by destroying Jerusalem, taking the people into exile. And sadly, his words became reality. Jeremiah lived through the siege and destruction of Jerusalem and witnessed the exile personally. Now, this book came into existence in a really interesting way. Chapter 36 tells us that after 20 years of Jeremiah's preaching in Jerusalem, God called him to collect all of his sermons and poems and essays and commit them to writing, which Jeremiah did by employing a scribe named Baruch, who wrote down and compiled all of this material into a scroll. Now, Baruch also gathered lots of stories about Jeremiah, and he linked all the pieces together. And so this is why the book reads like an anthology, a collection of collections. It's all been arranged to present this prophet as a messenger of God's justice and grace. So the book begins with God calling Jeremiah to be a prophet, and he's given a dual vocation. He will be a prophet to Israel, but also to the nations, and his words will both uproot and tear down, but also plant and build up. In other words, he's going to accuse Israel and warn them of God's coming judgment, but he also has a message of hope for the future. Now, this opening perfectly summarizes the first large section, chapters 1 to 24. It's a collection of Jeremiah's writings from before the exile. And the core idea here is that Israel has broken the covenant with God and violated all the terms of the agreement they made that are written in the Torah. And in a number of ways. They've adopted the worship of all kinds of Canaanite gods, building idol shrines all over the land, and Jeremiah develops the metaphor of idolatry as adultery, and uses the language of prostitution, promiscuity, unfaithfulness to describe how Israel has given their allegiance to other gods. Jeremiah also repeatedly accuses Israel's leaders. The priests, the kings, the other prophets have all become corrupt. They've abandoned the Torah and the covenant, which has led to a tragic result: rampant social injustice. The most vulnerable people in Israelite communities, the widows, the orphans, the immigrants, were all being taken advantage of in clear violation of the laws of the Torah, and Israel's leaders didn't even seem to care. So a classic place where all of these ideas come together is in chapter 7. It's called Jeremiah's Temple Sermon. The Israelites are coming to worship their God in the temple as if everything is just fine, but outside the temple they are worshiping other gods, and some were even adopting the horrifying Canaanite practice of child sacrifice. And so Jeremiah makes his very unpopular announcement. The God of Israel is coming in judgment. He's going to destroy his own temple and punish Israel by sending an enemy from the north. This is an army that God would allow to conquer Jerusalem, and as you read on, you discover he's talking about the great empire of Babylon. And so this all leads up to a transition in chapter 25. Israel hasn't turned back to their God, and so in the first year of Babylon's new king, Nebuchadnezzar, God tells Jeremiah to announce that the Babylonian armies are headed for Israel and all of its neighbors to conquer them and take them into exile for 70 years. He compares Babylon to a cup of wine filled to the brim with God's just anger at all of Israel's injustice and idolatry, and God will make Israel and the nations drink from this cup. Now, this chapter is key to the book's design because everything that follows is going to focus on Babylon's coming attack. First on Israel in chapters 26 to 45, and then on the other nations in chapters 46 to 51. The section about Israel first contains stories about how Jeremiah begged Israel to turn back, how he warned them right up to the last minute, but the leaders of Israel kept rejecting him. This section concludes with a large collection of stories about how Jerusalem was under siege and eventually destroyed by Babylon, and about how Jeremiah was persecuted all through that time and eventually kidnapped and taken against his will to Egypt by a group of Israelite rebels. Now, right here in the middle, in between all of these dark stories of disaster and judgment, is a collection of Jeremiah's messages of hope for Israel's future. So he picks up on Moses' prediction that after Israel had broken the covenant and gone into exile, see Deuteronomy 30, God would not abandon his people. Rather, he would renew his covenant with them and transform their hearts. Jeremiah develops this promise, and he says that God is going to one day inscribe the laws of the Torah, not on tablets, but rather on the hearts of his own people. He's going to heal their rebellion so that they can truly one day love and follow him fully. And so one day, Israel will return back to the land, and the Messiah from the line of David is going to come, and that's when all nations will come to recognize Israel's God as the true God. So these chapters are showing that despite Israel's apostasy, God is not going to let Israel's sin get the final word. Rather, his own faithfulness will bring about the fulfillment of his promises, no matter what. After this, we find the large collection of poems about how God is going to use Babylon to judge the nations around Israel. So Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Edom, Ammon, Damascus, Hazor. But then, surprisingly, the longest poems are saved for last, and they're about God's coming judgment on Babylon itself. So although God used this nation to execute his justice, God doesn't endorse their violence and idolatry. And so Babylon too will come under the standard of God's justice. And so Jeremiah denounces this nation's pride and injustice as well. Now, Babylon is larger than life in these poems, and it reminds us of the image of Babylon all the way back from Genesis chapter 11. Babylon has become the archetypal rebellious nation. In their glorification of wealth and war, God's going to give this nation over to its own destruction. The book concludes with a story taken from the end of the book of 2 Kings. It tells about Babylon's final attack on Jerusalem, how they destroyed the city walls and burned the temple and took the people into exile. The story shows how Jeremiah's warnings of judgment from chapters 1 through 24 were fulfilled. But then the chapter ends with a short story about the captive Israelite king Jehoiakim. He's heir to the line of David. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and shows him favor and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and that's how the book ends. So it's a little glimmer of hope. And this recalls Jeremiah's promises of hope from chapters 30 to 33. God hasn't abandoned his people or the promise of a future coming king from David's line. And so while this book contains a huge amount of warning and judgment, the final words conclude with a note of hope for the future. And that's what the book of Jeremiah is all about.
Camille.
Hi.
Hi, Camille.
Hello. Hi, John.
Does John have audio? Can we hear him? Can we hear John?
I don't think so.
I don't
Okay.
know that he has audio, but he can hear us. So he's audio to receiving audio. So so we got that summary on Jeremiah. What are your thoughts or initial reactions to reading parts of Jeremiah or hearing that summary?
Well, the first thing that jumped into my mind was, you better watch out. You better not.
Right. I got tired of all the threats of destruction by God.
Mhm.
Oh man,
Yeah, in this case,
sorry.
there's no Santa Claus.
Nope.
No.
Yeah, it was pretty, especially the section that we read 1 through 24. That is
Yes.
the destruction section, and pretty
Mhm.
nonstop.
Mhm.
Last week, yeah, John wrote pretty repetitive, predicting doom and gloom. Yeah, it was as
Mhm.
I was reading it too, it was like, yeah, I don't know, this is just kind of a downer. Okay, over and over again, a lot of destruction being predicted. And last week I had said Jeremiah 1, chapter 1, verse 10. It's kind of a summary of the whole book of Jeremiah. See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow. And we're reading in that to pluck up and to pull down section right now, when we're in Jeremiah. That's kind of the structure of Jeremiah. As the Bible Project said in their overview, is it does get to hope, it gets to, but it's still in Jeremiah,
Yeah,
it's
because,
like
yeah.
a glimmer of hope, not like, oh, look at the bright hope shining in us. It's a glimmer of promise and a glimmer of hope, not
Mhm.
a never like a extremely bright
Mhm.
light reading. But
Mhm.
that's also the role of the prophets again and again, to they speak truth to how things are going, and they don't sugarcoat anything. Not at all. And they do use a lot of repetition in there to drive points
Mhm.
home. Were
Mhm.
there other pieces that, as you were reading, really stuck out to you? Camille, I
Well,
see
this is
you've got the inclusive Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, there wasn't a great deal of anything that's really terrifically uplifting in these passages at all. And you know what it reminded me of? If you're familiar with the way Parkview used to do their treatment session for alcoholics who were reaching for recovery, their first task was to rip them apart, grind them into the ground until there was almost nothing left before you built them back up, before you gave them that hope and that promise and that joy. It's just that this treatment program sure did go on for a long time. It is no wonder people did not always rejoice when a prophet of this nature showed up.
Mhm.
And I would imagine it wasn't very comfortable for him either.
No, there was the section in there about, let's see, which chapter was that?
Interesting.
I want to say it's at 20. Yeah, 20. So Jeremiah was giving prophecies, and on chapter 20, Pashur strikes the prophet Jeremiah, puts him in the stocks that were in the
Mhm.
upper Benjamin gate of the house of the Lord. And he stayed overnight in the stocks because of what he was saying. And when they
Mhm.
let him out the next morning, Jeremiah cursed him for putting him in the stocks.
He
And
doesn't call them very nice things, does he?
no, he renames him Terror All Around.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, John pointed out that there seemed to be a slight change of tone, that after chapter 9, the gloom wasn't quite as elaborate. We shift in chapter 10 to talking more about the idols and the objects of worship, which seems to give a little bit of the shift away from the direct attack on the people.
Mhm.
And
Um,
it's also, we get into some of a lament that's going on too. And Jeremiah is lamenting the people and lamenting what's happening as well.
mhm,
That
mhm,
and it reminds us just of the humanity of the prophets, that um it they didn't want to do this either. They necessarily, like, they were seeing what's happening, but they rather would have not had to do what they're doing. They would rather have been able to say, look, you guys are awesome. We're doing great. Look how we care for the poor. Look how we care for one another. Um,
mhm,
and yeah, John points out that Jeremiah was complaining about his situation. And Jeremiah is one of the books where we get more of Jeremiah's story
mhm,
than we get in other places. And even with Jeremiah's laments that occur in here, there's some different ways to look at his laments that he's giving in here in this first section of Jeremiah. Um, it's structured really similar to the Psalms. And so some people, when reading the Psalms, they read the Psalms as far as that it's a collective, like, understanding of the Psalms. And then
mhm,
other people read the Psalms as these are songs from individuals. And some
mhm,
others read it as it's a mix of a collective
mhm,
song and songs from individuals. And
mhm,
Jeremiah's pieces are similar in structure to some of the Psalms.
mhm,
And so some people believe what Jeremiah's laments are like his personal laments about the situation.
mhm,
Other people believe, because of its similar structure to Psalms, that they might be collective laments and may not be just Jeremiah's laments, but
mhm,
laments of a collective people
mhm,
throughout time.
mhm.
And John points out in 20 how Jeremiah says he cannot hold it in.
Hold it all in.
And just
Mhm.
the grief that um I I mean, being in the midst of a pandemic, I think we can understand some of that grief too, that Jeremiah holds, that there reaches points where people are just like, I just can't hold this
Mhm,
all the things that we see and
mhm.
all of that.
You have to wonder if some people did not think they were mentally unbalanced.
That we
I mean,
all,
nobody can, yeah, no one can stay on the train of doom and gloom and projecting hideous futures and still have any semblance of happiness in them.
yeah,
They,
Mhm.
unless God was kind and eased
Mhm.
their own pain, their own fear, even a little bit, because the people certainly were not supportive.
right.
They didn't want to hear all this stuff.
No, certainly not.
You said God being kind. One of my problems with reading what we did so far tonight is it kept talking about the angry God will destroy this, and growing up, God has never been angry in my head. He's a loving, forgiving, all-encompassing
Mhm,
God. You can turn to him for a big hug
mhm,
whenever you need to. And yeah, that was hard to deal.
mhm,
Because sometimes I had the problem of reading literally. And so
mhm,
angry God,
mhm.
I just, I have trouble with it. It's my problem with my reading.
And I think that's a difference in whatever faith path we were introduced to as youngsters. My faith path began with nothing but an angry, belligerent um, God who was filled with justice, not a kind justice,
Ooh.
not an equitable justice. It was a God who was always on the lookout for what you were doing wrong and just jumping at the bit to punish you for it, to make you feel badly about it. God was someone you wanted to hide from because you were so afraid of doing the wrong thing. So you just wanted to be nondescript and blend into the walls as much as you possibly could. And I remember that from age 6 till I left that faith path. So I can relate to some of the things that were in here as far as it's going to come down on you, and it's going to come down on you hard. But it's not pleasant reading, and I'm sure it wasn't pleasant hearing when it was first delivered, when some of this stuff was first delivered. And I didn't catch your chat, John. What did you say?
He was asking if chapter 16 is addressed directly to Jeremiah. Don't have children, don't go to a funeral meal, do not go to feasts. So chapter 16, many people do understand that this one, the word of the Lord came to me, that it is God, that Jeremiah was not married and did not have children, and that this is in part of Jeremiah's like autobiography, or at least written down afterwards about his life, that he had a vision to not get married and not have children because of how the world was going. So that's a really common understanding, is that this is directly to Jeremiah and not necessarily directed at everyone, but directed at Jeremiah.
Because who is it? It says in chapter 20, don't get married.
So chapter 16.
16, yeah.
So that's chapter 16, verse 2. The word of the Lord came to me, you shall not take a wife, nor shall you have sons or daughters in this place. For thus says the Lord concerning the sons and daughters who are born in this place, and concerning the mothers who bear them, and the fathers who beget them in this land. They shall die of deadly diseases. They shall not be lamented, nor shall they be buried. They shall become like dung on the surface of the ground. They shall perish by the sword and by famine, and their dead bodies shall become food for the birds of the air and for the wild animals of the earth.
Yeah. Cheerful reading.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. John said it takes more joy out of his life. And yeah, I mean, Jeremiah was definitely in the midst of how he was seeing the world and how he was hearing God, and felt that he was called not to be married and not to have children, and really dedicated his whole life to sharing this message.
Oh, Buffy, you scared me. A few verses further on, it says, do not mourn the dead or to bring comfort to the living, says Yahweh, for I have withdrawn from this people my blessing, my love, and my mercy. What a horrible thought. What an absolute horrible thought. No.
Yeah. So this leads us up to the time of exile, the Babylonian exile. And these were probably compiled together after the return from the exile. And for sure, they felt like everything, that there was no blessing there,
Mhm.
that God had completely withdrawn everything from them, and they lost everything. Jerusalem was destroyed. They lost their land, they lost their homes, they lost their families, and it was complete, just
Mhm.
pain. But yeah, absolutely, to hear, see the world and see that, believe that you're completely, that
Mhm.
God's blessings completely gone from your life.
Well, that brings to mind the story of the Holocaust survivors, the men who met one evening and debated and decided God was dead. And then they had to call off the meeting because it was time for prayer. And I would imagine that would have been a desolate, hideous feeling. I think challenge can only be faced if you know that God is with you. Tell the people God's going to abandon you. You're going to be totally alone. You're going to be overrun. You're going to know horrible, horrible times. That had to be horrible just to listen to, much less really think about and live into, and then to live through its actual happening. Must have been just hideous, just absolutely hideous.
Yeah. There's so John also wrote because they had not listened to the correct prophets. And yes, but it's more than that. So the chapters leading up to it, it's not just that the people didn't listen to the correct prophets. The real crimes of the people would be that they're performing child sacrifice, and they're doing
Mhm.
things that are hurting one another, that they're not caring for the poor, they're not caring and uplifting one another, that they're because it says in here too that it's not just that they're hurting, like that they've turned away from God or they're hurting God, but they're, by doing that, they're actually hurting themselves. And
Mhm.
so it's a lot of the prophets talk a lot about social justice. And so it's not just turning away from the wrong prophets, but the ways that they're treating one another in community, and causing that communal pain as well. And
Mhm. Mhm.
with this, it reminds me of from Jeremiah 16, you shall not take a wife, nor shall you have sons or daughters in this place. There is I know among my generation and younger generations, many people just talk about whether or not to have children because
Mhm.
of like the impacts of climate change and
Mhm.
the impacts of what's going on in the world. And
Mhm.
that's um, it seems Jeremiah is kind of entering into that conversation a little bit
Mhm.
too
Mhm.
with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do know some young people who have made that decision.
Yeah. And people make
And
the decision for all different reasons.
mhm. And it's not just for the moment, it's very deliberative. They really take time and effort to think it all the way through. And I guess we each have to listen to that still small voice and go with it. It has to, discernment takes time.
And there's other um, prophets and others too in the Bible who um, hear a call from God not to be married or not to have children. So it's not
Mhm.
actually unique for
Mhm.
Jeremiah
Mhm.
with that there have been
Mhm.
others. And we see that through the history of religion as well. All of the lot of orders. Usually if people joined an order, they would not get married, or they would not have children if they didn't already. And so it also became a practice throughout, as the church formed and throughout time. So some other pieces, other things you guys that stuck out to you.
I'm just reading John's notes.
Yeah. So we have in these sections in Jeremiah, there's a couple visions, and he uses everyday objects pretty frequently that maybe are not as everyday objects for us, but would have been everyday objects for the people. Then his first vision in chapter 1, he talks about the almond tree. This is in chapter 1, verse 11 through verse 12. He says, it's in a vision, Jeremiah, what do you see? And I said, I see a branch of an almond tree. Then the Lord said to me, you have seen well, for I am watching. Your Bibles might have a note beneath this in the like really tiny print down underneath it. So almond tree, the word for that in Hebrew is shaked. And the word for watching is shoked. And so they're really similar words. And the almond tree is one of the first plants to bloom in Palestine. So it would bloom in late February, early March, maybe around that time period. And so there's in folklore, sometimes the almond tree is used as like, because it's the plant that would be bringing spring, that would be bringing renewal, would be bringing new life. And so it's an interesting usage here in Jeremiah. Another place where the almond tree is used is in Ecclesiastes 12, chapter 12, verse 5. And in that one, it goes like this. When one is afraid of heights and terrors are in the road, the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because all must go to their eternal home, and the mourners will go about the streets. So there's this image of the almond tree, which is used in many places as like an image of good times in spring and renewal. But in these two places in the Bible, it's used as like a sign of terror and a sign that bad times are actually coming. And so it's using a common image and flipping it upside down for the people. And it's also doing this wordplay on the Hebrew. And then, yeah.
I'm just going to say, going in from there, Lord's message came to me, Jeremiah, what do you see? You're just talking about the almond wood, the stick and stuff. But then the next vision is a pot of boiling water, which is not pretty at all.
No, so the pot of boiling water, in that one kind of locates us too. So the pot of boiling water is being poured towards the south in a particular direction. And because a lot of, just with where it's located, where Jerusalem is located, most threats came from the north. Because people would come down through the Fertile Crescent, because why not? Like, why would you go through the desert? You have a Fertile Crescent right there. And so you'd come through the Fertile Crescent, and that's where those threats would come down to Jerusalem from. And so this boiling pot pouring from the north onto the south is the second vision that is used in this one. And this is the one where we have the enemy from the north, where the enemy is not named. And so this is one of the places where it depends on when you think Jeremiah started his ministry. If you think at this point he's talking like way before Babylon was even a threat, and he's been speaking for quite a while, then as we talked about last week, this would probably be the Scythians that they were talking about. But if you think he was born at the start of what they're saying in Jeremiah, then, and this was later time period, then it would be the Babylonians would be the threat from the north. But either way, the 1 through 25 is taking us over a pretty long time span, leading us up to the exile. So this is, we read this in 1 week, okay, and heard these words, the repetition, and everything is awful. We read that in 1 week. That is not how the people would have been hearing it in 1 week. So think of it more over many years of hearing these messages, not just day after day after day. There would have been life in between too, which makes it a little more bearable, I think. But still, he reached the point where they put him in the stocks at night because they were like, we can't take this anymore. Like, you need a timeout, Jeremiah. And it's interesting in his parables. So this first section has a mix of visions and parables that are in here. And so we get the vision of the loincloth, which is such a flattering vision for the people. But then we get the parables of Jeremiah's unmarried status as well, and the potter's workshop in that broken pot. And then the two more visions in 24 and 25 of the basket of figs, and then the wine drinkers in 25. But in a lot of this, Jeremiah repeatedly uses the imagery of like sexual imagery and Israel being unfaithful to God and adultery, which is also interesting imagery for Jeremiah to use, since he never was married and didn't enter into that type of covenant. On one hand, but on another hand, marriage was a very different construct than it is now, in this time period, which I know many of you know. The history of marriage and what that's like has changed quite a bit over time. That at this period would have been a property exchange, and that's mostly it. Definitely not for love. Definitely not for companionship.
Were there arranged marriages?
There would have been arranged marriages. Yep. And usually a price was paid, and there was a return policy that you could do. It wasn't official unless you got pregnant that first night. Otherwise, you could return her. And so it was very contractual, not really covenantal as we view it now. But some of the practices we have now were similar practices in ancient Mesopotamia. So that sometimes people do in their weddings, things like the act of like giving the bride away at the start, that the father would be walking the bride down and then giving her away, is left over from the contractual pieces, and that the female was property or things like that. Now it's not done that way in weddings, thankfully. It's more like, let me give you a hug before you like go up there. It's mostly how it's done. Not a giving away, but just a person of support and a hug while they walk down.
Mhm.
And usually a welcome into our family handshake or something or hug.
Oh, there's a wedding, I think, over at the Lutheran Church, I think Lutheran Church or the Catholic Church in Mandan, it doesn't matter where. But the parents of the bride and the groom were standing facing each other. And one of them started to move to welcome. And the priest said, no, 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 wait. They come to you, to the bride, to welcome you into the groom's family. And likewise, the other side, it comes to them to welcome them in. It had made both of them come together. And it's sort of cool, you know.
That is neat.
When, okay, I'm joining so-and-so's family, it was a two-sided affair. It
Yeah,
was sort of the way it was done. Mhm.
that's really nice. It's nice when
Mhm.
they're taken and those rituals are updated without just doing them without thinking about them.
Mhm.
But I also share that because as we read about the how Jeremiah talks about Israel in here, he's talking about a deeper relationship than just like a marriage relationship. He's really talking about more of the covenantal relationship and like a deep love as well between God and God's people. Um, and so not the same as what we might think of as adultery in or as a marriage contract being broken or
Mhm.
the divorce from God wasn't necessarily an option. It was I, um, how do you divorce your creator? It's more that type of question. What were you going to say, Louise?
Nothing. I was playing with words in my head. Adultery and idolatry and adultery. The A and the
Yeah,
I.
yeah,
To me,
those are
they're
good.
similar.
They are, and that's a good play on words in English for sure, because that was one of the largest complaints of Jeremiah was that the people were worshiping idols, not just
Right.
because they were worshiping idols, but because of what they were doing because they were worshiping idols.
Mhm.
That because they were worshiping other gods, they weren't caring for one another anymore. Because
Mhm.
they were worshiping other gods, they were doing child sacrifice. Like because they were worshiping other gods, they were hurting each other. And that
Mhm.
was what the real crime of it was.
Mhm.
So, I mean, we went through the visions and these parables that we move through in here. Any other pieces that stuck out to you?
Mhm.
Um, maybe another piece would be in chapter 16, um, 16 verses 16 through 18. Sometimes there's questions on this because it goes, I am now sending for many fishermen, says the Lord, and they shall catch them. And afterward I will send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and every hill and out of the clefts of the rocks. And sometimes when we read in the Old Testament fishermen, because we are more familiar with the New Testament, we think of like the disciples or like, yeah, they're out
Mhm.
fishing for people. Like this is a great thing. But in this context, I'm sending for many fishermen probably is talking more about the Egyptians, that the Egyptians from who are closer to the Nile River and would have been more of fishermen are coming to get you. And who they don't get, then I'm sending the hunters, which would be then the Babylonians are coming and they're coming to get you. And so it's, we kind of have to tease apart a little bit that the remembering the New Testament's like much farther after the language of the Old Testament. I find it interesting in here how many personal laments Jeremiah has. Just how pained he also is through all of this. John is pulling out chapter 3. So if you go to chapter 3, verse 14. And he says it talks about choosing from one, speaks of choosing one from a town and 2 from a clan and give them to the shepherds. So let's see, starting at 14. Return, O faithless children, says the Lord, for I am your master. I will take you, 1 from a city and 2 from a family. I will bring you to Zion. I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will feed you with knowledge and understanding. And when you have multiplied and increased in the land in those days, says the Lord, they shall no longer say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It shall not come to mind or be remembered or missed, nor shall another one be made. At that time, Jerusalem shall be called the throne of the Lord, and all nations shall gather to it in the presence of the Lord on Jerusalem, and they shall no longer stubbornly follow their own evil will.
What was that? Chapter 3, what?
Chapter 3, verse 14, starting.
Oh, okay. Yep.
And John, are you asking about like the difference between the town and the clan? Or I think there's a bit of a glimmer of hope in here, and probably yes, as far as the return, like the time of return from exile, and that taking people, 1 from a city, 2 from a family, bring you to Zion, taking people, and it sounds like your translation has 1 from a town and 2 from a clan, that even as they're in exile, it's almost foreshadowing a little bit that they won't lose everything, that they'll still be connected in some way to their heritage. And even though they're pulled from a foreign city, that they will still have their grouping or their family or their clan.
This one just says from every 2 people from every family. They use the word family in here.
Okay. Camille, what does yours use for 14?
Oh, tribe.
Uses tribe.
And also you said faithless people, and mine says rebellious people. And I get a different annotation when I think of people who are faithless and people who are rebellious. Faithless just me would be, okay, I know what is right, but it's just too much of a burden. So I'm going to do my own thing. Rebellious means I'm going to fight against what I know, what I have been taught previously. I know that is just a nuance, but I get a whole different flavor when I think of that.
Yeah, I think in Hebrew it is both of those words together.
Okay.
Is more of the meaning. It's more like to have turned aside from. So to have turned aside from the path that you were on, and to turn aside from your faith too. So both being rebellious and faithless. Because it's still using the metaphor, it's still using in this place is the adulterous wife, or it's the wife's not the right word, just because that's a different understanding of marriage in that time period, but like an adulterous partner, I guess, or it's not even the right word either. Covenantal one. And maybe children is just the right word. A rebellious
Obedient
faithless
children.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, down to 19, by the Lord, I want to treat you like my own children. I want to give you a pleasant land more beautiful, blah, blah, blah. I thought you would call me father. I thought you would always follow me. But you've been like a woman that is unfaithful to her husband, family of Israel. You have been unfaithful to me. This message was from the Lord. It goes on about crying in the hills and stuff like that.
Yeah. It's so so much grief. I thought you would follow, when you didn't.
Mhm. The later on says, Israel, if you want to come back, then come back to me. Throw away your idols. Don't wander away from me.
When you mentioned chapter 18, that's one that really stuck with me as well, about the potter and the clay. You know, if the potter is making something and it's not quite right, he's going to just demolish it, make something that is pleasing to him. And God tells them, or makes the analogy, why can't I do the same? You know, what would surprise you with my doing the same? House of Israel, can I not do to you what this potter does? It is Yahweh who speaks. Indeed, like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, house of Israel. And I don't know, that would send shivers down my back if I were hearing it from someone that I respect tremendously. And I guess that's the problem. People really did not respect Jeremiah very much. They really didn't they wanted him to shut his mouth, is what they wanted.
Yeah, and the other thing I find interesting is, like, a potter's clay, we don't see any judgment or no negative judgment upon a potter destroying a pot. That, like,
Right.
if a pot's not working, then you would destroy that vessel. And if you think of as the house of Israel, not just, I mean, they're a collection of people, but it's also a structure of laws, and it's a governmental system. And so, if that's another way to read it too, as God saying, Jeremiah also saying, like, God's going to tear down this system that you've set up, the whole structure that you have. It's not a good vessel for you, that you, and it's, I mean, the pottery holds the water, which is water of life. And if there's a vessel, a community law system that doesn't work properly to hold life, then why wouldn't we want it to be destroyed too? And so sometimes I think maybe we put the angry God, or the, like, an evil type of setting on God, when maybe the destruction of some things isn't actually a bad thing. That there are things in our lives, there are systems that are so broken that they are just causing pain. And why shouldn't they be destroyed? Maybe we should tear them down. Maybe we should take it back to the wheel and have it be reformed.
It just popped into my mind. I had an appointment today to get my injections and stuff. And the same could be said about government bureaucracy, because my nurse had to input a ton of information that the pharmacy had already input once, but she had to redo it. And it just took up, I'd say, a significant amount of time just getting all that stuff in the computer. And I'm thinking, if ever there were a vessel that needs to be collapsed and rebuilt, it's bureaucracy. It's just what we have to go through to get anything done these days. And Louise is smiling.
Well, I'm
She can
thinking,
relate.
okay, you're talking about the nurse has to get all that information. Hey, punch the button. It's all on the computer. It's been there since the first time you gave that information. And why do you have to keep repeating it? Why do every time I go into a certain doctor, I have to fill this ridiculous form about my history? Zip, 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 zip,
Every time.
We're supposed to save paper. We're supposed to be more efficient.
Yep. John
Yeah.
says amen.
Yeah, I hear you. But I understand that analogy when it comes down to relating it to what is in my life today that I can understand. And that's one thing I understand very well. It's just gotten so out of control, and
you see,
it doesn't even border on the ridiculous anymore. It has crossed the border. And it just seems like such a waste of time, effort, personnel, paper. I think we used 3 or 4 times more paper than we did when we were without a computer.
Right. Do you see what John wrote?
Yeah,
No,
John wrote amen.
Amen.
We are in agreement.
Yeah.
Which is unusual in a Bible study from Friday mornings. We have some interesting debates. It's really neat. Because we have several different versions from which we read, and they each bring something special to the discussion. It's really
it's good to
wonderful.
read from different versions because they are translations. And so there's not a word for word like translation in every language. Each language has different priorities. And so a lot of times what was in Hebrew or Greek is actually a mixture of English words. And so if you can read different ones, that helps a lot.
Yep.
This Bible that I use is, shall I say, simplified because it's the English version for the deaf. And people wonder, why for the deaf? But the reason is down at the bottom, there's usually extra little notes. How often do we use the word apostle or prophet in our everyday conversation with people? And if you think of somebody who's totally hearing impaired, think of what we say that might need some, especially going into studies of stuff, might need some explanation. And so this is, it said, I've lost it now, but take 1 from the city and 2 from your family. That's not what the other, how they word it, from your clan and stuff. But this is from your family. I think that's an everyday thing for hearing impaired. So, and then down the bottom, if you read all the notes at the bottom, you get the whole story.
Yeah. Well, I think this clay in the potter's hands is a good place to kind of pull it together for tonight, because there is, I think, also a shred of hope in the midst of all of this despair. And if you think of it as also, so the people who are profiting from the systems that are going on right now in Jerusalem, this is horrible news for them. But there are people who are in the systems that are dying and needlessly. And there are people who are being oppressed. There's people, there's children who are being sacrificed. And this would not be bad news to hear a prophet come and say, this will all fall. And this whole container that you have is all going to fall down. And it needs to fall down because of everything that's happening in this place, that it is not right. And so the prophet's also speaking up for the people who are being hurt and being oppressed in this. And that is good news. Even though it is painful to hear, and it means change, which is often painful, but sometimes the change is the only thing that actually will bring new life, even if the change is really hard. And the change for them was extremely difficult.
What's our reading assignment next?
So
45?
yeah, so how far do you think we could finish Jeremiah? Do you think we could make it through 51, or is that too much?
No, I think
Ooh.
we could do through 51.
Or 52?
What do
I
you
mean?
think? What do you think, Louise?
You mean just finish it?
Just finish it.
Okay.
Yep.
Because we have left in the Old Testament. This has been, well, we started this in 2018, and then we were doing good, and then like we got a pandemic, but so we have left in the Old Testament that we haven't read. Would be if we finish Jeremiah, then we've got Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and then we could move to the New Testament. Unless we just want to stay in the Old Testament, then we can start over again. But I think maybe people are ready for the New Testament.
Yeah, I'd like to go through the last books in the Old Testament
Yes.
and then start the new.
Yeah. So if we finish up Jeremiah, I think this year we could finish up the Old Testament really easily then. And but we're gonna get a little deeper, or maybe a little darker, because we will be going into Lamentations next. But we'll keep looking for hope in the midst of it. And just like with Advent coming, then hopefully we can time it that with Advent we'll be on the upswing with the brighter light. That's my goal.
That would be good. That would be good.
Work with the
And
seasons.
Maybe that's a good thing to be looking for, also those glimmers of hope in the midst of the bad news, and maybe make special notation of those, so we can see that a little bit of sunlight goes into all of those shadows as well.
Yeah.
I'll take slivers anytime.
Jeremiah does hand them out, even though they are also in the midst of a lot of other things.
Okay, well, I'm gonna leave if we are